Welcome back to Naked History Debrief, the companion commentary show where we pick up the historical laundry we left on the floor, shake it out, and occasionally find something radioactive in the pocket. This is the after party for our episode on the Radium Girls, which is a strange thing to say because the story is not exactly party material. It's grief, greed, science, labor law, denial, and corporate cowardice all dipped into one glowing poisonous jar. But it's also a story about young women who were told they were disposable and then proved with their bodies and their testimonies and their last scraps of strength that they were not. So today we're not retelling the whole main episode. We already walked through the factory floors, the lip pointing, the luminous watch dials, the jaw pain, and the awful realization that the glow was never magic. It was a warning sign with just some good lighting. So today we're going to be doing what the debrief does best. We are opening the drawer of extra weird, extra devastating, and extra important details. We're going to talk about what we didn't have time to fully address in the main episode. The radium craze before the factories, the safe science behind workplace theater, and the other dial-painting towns across New Jersey, the women whose names deserve more space, and the environmental afterlife of all that glowing waste, and the very uncomfortable fact that companies often know more than they admit, especially when admitting that it costs money. And then, because history refuses to stay in its own lane, we'll close with a This Week in History for the week of June 15th. So take a breath, maybe don't lick any paintbrushes, and let's debrief. So the first thing we had to talk about is that radium didn't enter the world as a villain. And that is what makes this story so dangerous. Radium arrived with a glow of progress. I mean, literally, it shimmered. It seemed futuristic. It looked like science had reached into the dark and came back holding a tiny bottled sunrise. But in the early 20th century, radium was not treated like an invisible threat. It was treated like a miracle, like a luxury, like a cure, or a beauty ingredient, or a status symbol. Humanity discovered a radioactive element and immediately said, "Can we put that in face cream?" And the answer is unfortunately yes, because the past was basically a group project where no one read the safety sheet. Now, radium showed up in tonics and cosmetics and medical devices, wellness products, and things people drank, rubbed on their skin, wore near their bodies, and trusted because they were wrapped in a language of modern science. And this matters because the Radium Girls were not walking into a world where radium was already universally understood as a poison. They were walking into a world where radium had a public image problem in reverse. People thought that it was too good. It glowed, it was rare, it was expensive, it was associated with laboratories, doctors, and the future. And it had the same cultural energy as this new technology will fix everything. Which, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is usually when we should hide our wallets and maybe our bones. And then the dial painting industry took that glow miracle and industrialized it. The women painting watch faces and instrument dials were not just making accessories, they were making tools for modern life. Luminous dials mattered. Soldiers, pilots, factory workers, and ordinary consumers wanted clocks and watches that they could read in the dark. During and after World War I, glowing instruments had very real military and commercial value. But the danger was unevenly distributed. And that phrase is gonna matter, because the executives, chemists, and managers were often not doing the same work in the same way as the women on the factory floor. The women were encouraged to shape the brushes with their lips, the lip dip paint way of doing it. It sounds almost dainty until you realize it was a work rhythm that delivered radioactive material straight into their bodies. And that's where the science gets especially nasty, because radium is chemically similar enough to calcium that the body can treat it like something useful. So when the workers swallowed tiny amounts of radium paint, their bodies did not simply say, "Oh, absolutely not, demon glitter, please leave through the gift shop." Instead, radium settled into the bone, and once it was there, it irradiated the body from within. And that's the horror of this story. It's not that the women were just exposed, it's that the exposure moved inside them and stayed. Their bones became the crime scene. In the main episode, we talked about radium jaw, but it's worth sitting with the cruelty of that phrase because radium jaw almost sounds like a medical curiosity, like something in an old-timey doctor's notebook next to wandering womb and too many opinions. But what it meant was genuine pain. It meant infection, teeth loosening, fractures, faces changing, bodies breaking from the inside out. And because this was happening to young working class women, the first instinct of the system was not to believe them. Which, shocking. History? Not believing women in pain? Someone get me my fainting couch. Now, the doctors just misdiagnosed them. Dentists pulled teeth without understanding the larger poisoning. Some symptoms were blamed on other conditions, and in some cases, there were efforts to smear the women morally. Because if you can't defeat the evidence, you can always try to assassinate the character. And that's one of the oldest playbooks in the Corporate Denial Handbook. Step 1, deny the harm. Step 2, question the victims. Step 3, produce a report. And Step 4, hide the report if it says anything you don't want it to say. And then finally, Step 5, act shocked when people notice. Now, the radium companies did not invent that playbook, but they performed it with the truly radioactive enthusiasm. One of the details I always find especially infuriating is the gap between what the workers were told and what some experts had already suspected. The factory women were told that the material was safe enough to put in their mouths. Meanwhile, people working with radium in the more scientific or managerial settings would use protective measures. And that contrast is the whole story in miniature. It wasn't simply ignorance, it was selective caution. When the risk belonged to the company, caution appeared. When the risk belonged to the woman, caution suddenly became very expensive, very inconvenient, and apparently very hard to locate. And this is why the Radium Girls story is not just a medical tragedy, it's a labor story. It's a public health story, it's a story about who gets protected first. Because workplace danger does not usually fall from the ceiling at random, it follows power. Who is replaceable, who is believed, who is watched, who is studied, who is compensated, and who is going to keep going because the schedule was tight and the product needs shipping. The women were not just harmed by radium, they were harmed by a system that treated their suffering as business inconvenience. And that brings us to something the main episode may have not had fully time to explore. This didn't happen in one place. The New Jersey story is the famous one, especially the U.S. Radium Corporation plant in Orange. That is often where people begin with this story, and for good reason, because the litigation there became a major public scandal. But dial painting happened in multiple places. Ottawa, Illinois matters. Waterbury, Connecticut matters. Other workers across the United States and Canada matter. By the 1920s, thousands of workers had already been involved in radium dial painting. And when a story is spread across multiple towns, it becomes harder to treat as one unfortunate accident. One factory can be dismissed as a mistake. Multiple factories, however, start to look like an industry fault. In Ottawa, Illinois, Catherine Donahue becomes one of the names we need to say out loud, because Catherine was a dial painter who became desperately ill and helped push the legal fight forward even as her body was failing. Her testimony is one of those moments where history stops being abstract, because it's easy to say the workers fought for justice. It's harder to remember what that meant in practice. It meant sick women having to prove the obvious. It meant people whose bodies were already collapsing having to spend their remaining energy convincing courts, companies, and the public that the growing substance they had been told was harmless had, in fact, ruined their lives. Catherine Donahue reportedly gave testimony when she was too weak to appear in the ordinary way. And that's not a courtroom drama flourish, that's what happens when the legal system moves slower than a poisoned body. The law likes paperwork, however, radiation cares not. That's one of the bleaker tensions of the Radium Girls story. The women needed justice urgently, and the companies benefited from delay. And delay isn't neutral. Delay can and will be used as a strategy. If a company can postpone accountability long enough, witnesses die. The public attention shifts and medical evidence gets argued into fog. Legal costs will climb and families eventually get exhausted. And suddenly the question becomes not who caused this, but how long can you afford to keep fighting? That's why the courage of these women mattered so much. They were not fighting because they were expected to be saved. In many cases, they already knew that they wouldn't be. They were fighting to be believed. They were fighting so the next girl hired to paint a glowing number onto a watch dial would not be told to put poison in their mouth and smile. And this is usually where the legacy gets a little complicated. You'll sometimes hear people say that the Radium Girls created OSHA or directly gave us modern workplace safety laws, and that's a little bit too simple. OSHA as an agency comes much later in the 1970s, and the line for it is not that straight. But their cases absolutely helped change the conversation around occupational disease, employer responsibility, industrial poisoning, and worker protection. They helped prove that workplace illness could be slow, invisible, cumulative, and still very, very real. And that matters, because a machine accident is obvious. A missing finger is very, very hard to ignore, and a crushed limb is immediate evidence. But poisoning, radiation, dust inhalation, chemical exposure, those are easier for companies to deny because the damage can unfold over years. The workplace harm follows the worker home. It appears in doctors' offices, hospital beds, dental chairs, family kitchens. The factory can be clean by then. The payroll records can look boring, and the executives can say, who would have known? But the Radium Girls answer from the grave. You could have, and you should have. And eventually, people did know. Another piece we didn't linger on enough is the afterlife of the factories themselves. Because radium does not simply stop being a problem when the shift ends. Old dial painting sites left behind contamination, building soil, debris, equipment, and waste could remain radioactive long after the companies moved on, or changed names, or closed their doors. This is part of the industrial history that rarely gets the dramatic lighting, because it's not one trial or one newspaper headline, it's decades of cleanup, testing, remediation, and local anxiety. The past doesn't always stay in the archive, sometimes it stays in the ground. And that's such a naked history sentence right there, it might need its own little warning label. The past doesn't always stay in archives, sometimes it stays in the ground. And with radium, that is literally true. And this is why environmental history belongs with the Radium Girls story. The same corporate behavior that endangered workers could also endanger communities. Waste doesn't vanish because the company stops putting it on the brochures. A contaminated site is a kind of memory, a very expensive, very hazardous memory. And the radium dial industry left those memories behind. Now, I do want to talk about the women not just as victims, but as workers. Because one of the traps of telling this story is that the suffering is so dramatic, so physically horrifying, that it can swallow everything else. We remember the jawbones, we remember the glowing teeth, and we remember the courtroom images, and yes, those details matter, but before they were symbols, these women were young people with jobs. They earned wages, they were making friends, they were proud of their skilled work. Some wore an ice close to work, and some painted their nails or faces for fun because they had been told the paint was safe. And that detail is often repeated as if it were foolish on their part, but it's unfair. They weren't foolish, they were lied to, and that is a big difference. If your employer tells you something is safe, if the culture around you treat it as a modern and miraculous miracle, then if people with credentials don't warn you, then using the material casually is not stupid, it is trust. And trust is exactly what was exploited here. The lip dip paint method was not some random personal habit the women invented because they were reckless, it was a part of the work process. It made the brush tip sharp, and it made the work faster and more precise. And since many dial painters were paid by the piece, speed mattered. And there it is again, the danger follows the money. Piecework created pressure, and the more dials that you painted, the more that you earned. The thinner the brushwork, the cleaner the number, the faster the rhythm, the better the output. Lip dip paint. It's catchy in the worst possible way. The phrase has an awful simplicity of a nursery rhyme and the moral weight of an indictment. And it's one of the reasons why the story still lands. It's not about a strange substance from the early atomic age of wonder. It's about work practices that make danger feel normal. Every generation has some version of this. The substance changes, the industry changes, the job title changes, but the logic stays the same. We need you to do this quickly, and we need you to trust us. We need you to not ask too many questions, and we need you to understand that safety slows production. And then when people get hurt, suddenly everyone is very committed to uncertainty. That may be one of the most timeless and disgusting parts of the Radium Girls story, the weaponization of uncertainty. Were they really harmed by the radium? Was it really from the factory, and can we prove that? Could something else might have caused it? Were the women exaggerating? And are the doctors sure they're telling the truth? Shouldn't we wait for more studies? Now, to be clear, science should be careful. Evidence matters, but there's a difference between responsible caution and paid confusion. Paid confusion is when uncertainty becomes a smoke machine, and the Radium Girls spent years trying to cough their way through that smoke. So where does it leave us? It leaves us with a story that glows in two directions. One glow is the false glow. The product, the marketing, the miracle cure, the beautiful luminous dial, the little painted numbers shining in the dark. The other glow is the legacy. The women who made the danger visible, the workers who forced private suffering into public record, the legal cases that helped push occupational disease into the national conversation, the testimony that survived even when they did not. Now, companies wanted glow without accountability, and the Radium Girls became that accountability. And it's why we tell this story. Not because it's gruesome, though let's be honest, it is very, very gruesome. The past really said, what if workplace safety, but make it body horror? I mean, we tell it because it asks a question that is still relevant. When profit and safety collide, who gets protected from the blast? And if the answer is not the workers, then congratulations, you've built a machine that runs on people. And history has some notes. But let's get into this week in history. And this is the week of June 15th, and apparently history looked at the calendar and said, let's put constitutional law, war declarations, emancipation, statehood, world fairs, and one very ominous hotel break-in in the same 7-day stretch. Because subtlety is for cowards. So we start on June 15th, 1215, with the Magna Carta. King John of England, a man who appears throughout history with the general vibe of a wet sock wearing a crown, was forced by rebellious barons to seal Magna Carta in Runnymede. Now, Magna Carta was not democracy in the modern sense. Let's not get carried away and pretend medieval barons were sitting around inventing universal human rights over a charcuterie board. Now, this was an elite power struggle. Rich men with swords who were mad at richer men with a throne. But the document mattered because it did place limits, even imperfect ones, on royal authority, and it helped establish the idea that the king was not simply above the law. And that idea has had a long afterlife. The Magna Carta becomes one of those historical documents that gets quoted, mythologized, stretched, amplified, and occasionally dragged into arguments by people who have definitely never read it. Still, at its core, it gives us one of history's favorite reoccurring themes. Powerful people being told, actually, no, you can't just do whatever you want. A message that, frankly, several centuries of executives, monarchs, and guys named Chad in the comment sections would like to revisit. Also on June 15th, but much later in 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. This is one of those moments that sounds inevitable because you know the ending. Of course Washington gets the job, and of course he becomes the American icon, and of course he ends up on money, statues, paintings, and every school worksheet involving a powdered wig. But in 1775, nothing was inevitable. The colonies were entering open rebellion against one of the most powerful empires on Earth. And they needed someone who could hold together an army that was underfunded, undersupplied, politically complicated, and occasionally held together with vibes and reasonable resentment. So June 15th gives us the Magna Carta limiting a king and Washington preparing to fight one. Man, history does love a theme. Now moving to June 16th, 1963, we get Valentina Tereshkovka, becoming the first woman in space aboard Vostok 6. Her call sign was Chiaka, meaning seagull, which is objectively cooler than most email usernames any of us have ever created. Tereshkovka orbited Earth 48 times, and her flight was a major milestone in space race. It was also mainly for Soviet propaganda, but because of course it was. The space race was science, ambition, engineering, danger, and two superpowers aggressively showing off in the sky. But propaganda or not, the achievement was very real. Then on June 17, 1972, history gives us Watergate. 5 men were arrested after breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Now at first it looked just like a strange burglary. Then it became a scandal, and then it became the scandal. The one that put gate into the American language forever, ruining suffixes for almost everyone. Watergate eventually exposed abuses of power, political espionage, cover-ups, secret recordings, and a presidency unraveling in the public. What makes Watergate such a useful historical marker is not just the break-in, but its cover-up. Because again, hello, theme of the episode, institutions often survive the original wrongdoing better than they survive the frantic, sweaty attempt to hide it. Now, the burglary was bad, but the cover-up was catastrophic. And there's a lesson here, and history keeps writing it on the board in ever-increasingly larger letters. If you're already in a hole, stop installing a basement. Then on June 18, 1812, the United States declares war on Great Britain, beginning the War of 1812. Now this war is sometimes treated like the sequel to the American Revolution, except messier, less coherent, and with very not good branding. That causes included British interference with American trade, impressing of sailors, and frontier conflicts, and a young United States trying to reassert itself into a world still dominated by European empires. The War of 1812 consists of the burning of Washington, D.C., the defense of Fort Henry, the writing of what becomes the Star-Spangled Banner, and Andrew Jackson writing the Battle of New Orleans into national celebrity even though the peace had already been signed, because apparently no one had push notifications on back then. It was a war full of confusion, nationalism, maritime grievances, and a capital city learning the hard way that buildings can, in fact, catch on fire a lot easier than we expect. Then we arrive at June 19th, 1865, otherwise known as Juneteenth. On that day, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced that enslaved people in Texas were free. This came more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and months after the end of the Civil War. And that delay matters, because Juneteenth is not simply the day slavery ended, because emancipation in the United States was uneven, contested, and enforced by military power. It was resisted heavily by enslavers and followed by new systems designed to control black labor and black lives. But Juneteenth marks a very profound moment because the announcement of freedom reaching people who had deliberately been kept from it. It's a celebration, but it's also an indictment, because freedom delayed is not some clerical error, but it is power refusing to let go. And that connects in a very different context to so many stories that we cover here. The law can say one thing, but reality can lag very much behind. Rights on paper still need people willing to enforce them, fight for them, and defend them when someone tries to shove them back in the drawer. Juneteenth asks us to remember not only emancipation, but the long struggle to make freedom real. And finally, on June 21st, 1893, the first Ferris wheel opens at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And yes, after the Magna Carta, Watergate, Juneteenth, the war, I am absolutely ending it with a giant wheel. Because sometimes history gives us laws, blood, struggle, and political theory, and sometimes it gives us a massive rotating flex built because America wanted to answer the Eiffel Tower. The original Ferris wheel was designed by George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. Now try saying that name 5 times fast. I barely said it once. Now, it was made by him for the Chicago World's Fair. It was enormous for its time and engineering spectacle meant to prove that the United States could build something as impressive as anything Europe had produced. It was part amusement ride, part architectural boast, part, hey, look what we can do, which is basically the World's Fair spirit in a nutshell. And I love the drama here. France builds the Eiffel Tower, and America responds saying, hey, fine, but what if we made a wheel, but huge? It's petty, it's expensive, and it's historically on brand for the United States. So what does this week in history give us? It gives us a limit on kings, a general chosen for revolution, a woman in orbit, a burglary that becomes a constitutional crisis, a war declaration, and a delayed announcement of freedom, and a Ferris wheel big enough to make the national pride dizzy, which is a lot for 1 week. June 15th through the 21st is basically history opening 7 tabs at once and wondering why the computer is blazing hot. And all of that brings us back somehow to the Radium Girls. Because all of these stories, in one way or another, are about power being challenged. Kings, empires, presidents, enslavers, governments, companies, systems that insist they are too big, too normal, too profitable, and too important to be questioned. And then someone questions them anyway. The Radium Girls didn't have armies, they didn't have thrones, they didn't have the luxury of time. What they had was testimony, pain, evidence, and a refusal to let companies bury the truth along with them. And that's why this story still glows. Not because radium is beautiful, but because they were brave. Now, that's it for this episode of Naked History Debrief. If this story made you angry, congratulations, your moral compass is working. If it made you want to research workplace safety law, industrial poisoning, or historical corporate nonsense, welcome to the club. We have snacks, but we test them for radium first. So if you like your history weird, dramatic, or slightly undressed, follow Naked History on Spotify. We're trying to reach some follower goals here, so every follow genuinely helps this little historical chaos machine keep growing. And if you know someone who loves scandal, science, lawsuits, labor history, or stories where the villain is a corporation with the moral spine of wet cardboard, send them this episode. And if you have a question or correction, drop them in the comments below. We love interacting with everybody out there, everybody who's listening, and we definitely like to keep our history factually accurate, but dramatically interesting. And don't forget to rate the show, give it 5 stars, slap it on, make those stars glow almost as if they were covered in radium. I promise you won't get an infection or worse. My lawyer said to not guarantee anything. So, as always, until next time and the next main episode, we will see ya. Make sure to stay positive, stay weird, and stay naked. Historically speaking, of course. Have a good one.